Hi, it's Sunday. Today's a yard say for my father. So I want to say I did a CMO in Nidrim, and I want to say a few words in connection with Nidrim, Mesechta Nidrim. And I also want to give a special shout out to Howard C. Mayachayim, you and the mayor, who helped me with getting this farm I need, some of them. And also, he's in Lakewood today with special needs students for his nephew's bar mitzvah, the student's nephew's bar mitzvah, Moshe Schloss. So I give a shout out to them also. Thank you all. Now, so I'll start from the beginning. Here we go. This is for the 52nd yard set of my father, 52 years. The last Mishnah in Nidrim says that if a wife says, Tamei ani l'cha, in other words, she's Ashes Kohen, she'amra nasti, he's violated, her husband has to divorce her. Why? I mean, no Adam. One opinion is simply because Shavia Nafshecha Tichidi Surah. Although that has its own set of problems, because actually the Rishonim say she's Meshubed to her Baal for things like that, which affect the application of Shavia Nafshecha Tichidi Surah, but I'm not going to go into that. The other opinion is that we believe her because of a different reason. We actually believe her when she says Tmei Ani L'cha. So she's an Ashes Cohen and she said I was raped. And they get divorced. Why? We're convinced she's telling the truth. Not B'Torah's Edus or anything like that, but because the humiliation she must feel is so painful that Anan Sahadi she must be telling the truth. In other words, we believe her statement reflects the truth. The Mishnah at the end of the Nidrim goes on to relate a piece of legislative history. In later times, Chazal changed the rules and legislated that if she says Tamei ani l'cha, she is not believed, and the husband should not divorce her, absent some evidence, of course. The Mishnah says, Barishono haya omrim, shalosh noshim yotzos v'notlos ksuva, and one of them was Homer's Tamei ani l'cha. So she gets her ksuva because she says she was raped. All we know is what she said. There's no edus. She didn't do anything wrong. She's a victim. Therefore, she gets ksuva, but they can't stay married. Because once she was raped, she has a din of a zona. A halachic zona, that is. The Mishnah goes on to say, Chazru lomar, shelo tehei isha nosenes eineho ba'acher, that she shouldn't want to marry someone else. No, she's married to the Kohen, but she wants to ditch her husband and marry another person, which we consider a bad thing. Kalkelis al baila, Ella, and she's going to mess her husband over. Ella homeris tamei ani l'cha tavi ra'y v'reha. So if she says I'm tummy to you, in other words, if she says I had to be with someone else to her husband, which by a Kohen would make her also to stay with her husband under any circumstances, she is disbelieved. She is not believed in principle. This is a remarkable piece of legal history. At first, they held she's telling the truth. We believe Bia occurred, requiring her divorce from her Kohen husband, as per the halacha. Subsequently, they ruled she's not believed at all. The Rishonim asked the obvious question: how can Chazal do that? What if she's actually telling the truth? If she is, then you're violating an Issa D'Oraisa that a Kohen cannot stay married to a woman who had Bia Tachta B'chol Ofen Sheyeh, even if she was raped. Now, you can't tell me all women lie because of a now nosta ba'acher. Not all women are like that. Some women are like that. Some Rishonim say maybe most, whatever. Some. So if she's not from the floozies, then she's telling the truth. There's no sure way to ascertain. So how can we say that all wives of Kohanim are disbelieved? Ha'isur de'oraisa l'heichon halach. This is the question of the Rishonim. It's a famous question and led to all kinds of answers because that's what a good question does. So there are a number of suggested answers, but each one has a problem, a flaw. The Ran, the Ran and the Nidrim, right? Cites an opinion that Chazal implement Afkina Rabbanu L'Kedusha Minei. They retroactively annul the original marriage with a regular kosher Jew, whereby at the time she was raped by a regular kosher Jew in terms of yichus, she wasn't married to her Kohen husband, because of retroactive annulment. That's what Afkos Kedushin is. This does work because, as we know, such a tactic is known in Chazal. It's all over the Gemara. The flaw, of course, is this only works if she said she had bia with a regular Jew of unblemished yichus, now retroactively regarded as having taken place prior to her marriage with a Kohen, but not if the rapist was, for example, a guy, a ger, or a mamzer, or any other kind of psul kahuna. If he was, then the Kohen husband will have to divorce her anyway, because she will be classified as a halachic zona. So if for argument's sake, somebody's not Jewish, did it to her, she has a din of a zona. I mean, I'm talking the halacha of a zona. Not that she's a zona, but to halacha she's regarded as a zona. And that would defeat the whole Mishnah Achrona, because she can still trigger at will a divorce. So all she has to do is say like this, Nanasti al yedei goy, Nanasti al yedei mamzer, or something like that. Right? So how can this prevent a neho nosna ba'acher? In other words, the Mishnah's ruling is unqualified and applies to all women, whereas the explanation of the Ran works only in some cases. The Ran himself concedes this. The Ran says, the didi lo kashali, the chihechi damrina makal meduchti makadish kol makadish adat rabban makadish vavkina bal kedusha mine hachana me hacha kol sham labal tamei anilach avkina bal kedusha me kara de mafkina kedushin v'nimse shebeshal shenensa penuya haisa v'vshum hachi shar labayla v'eches betruma. But the Ran says ela shafi zeh mitzdarach loymar the chiamrina hachi. When does this work? You have to say Dafka omeres tmeani l'cha she'nasti ne'nasti ulakosha nevalti. It only says if she claims it was done with somebody who's unblemished yichus. Abel be'omeres tmeani lach she'nasti minesino min mamzer, for example, einu v'teres l'bayla ve'einu v'mashman. The Mishnah is not mashman anybody. The Mishnah said this is a rule that applies across the board. Anytime a woman says tmeani l'cha, she's not believed. And how would that work with the Kohen case if it was a mamzer? The Rashba has a different, more radical explanation. Basically, get over it. The Chachamim, Sanhedrin, whoever, do indeed have the power to make an Isser D'Oraisa go away. In fact, they have the power to make any Isser D'Oraisa go away. Such is the meaning when the Torah says, Ubasa laKohanim alavim, ve'ela shofet asher yeh b'yomim mohen, v'degarashto v'chiducho es dvar mishpat, they'll tell you what to do when you listen. Obviously, they wouldn't do it without a compelling reason, but if such a reason exists in their judgment, their power is unlimited, even against existing Torah laws themselves. The only thing they cannot do is say that God changed his mind. He reversed himself, like Christianity or something like that. That's ulafuke, as the Rifa puts it in Yavamas Sadi. Ulafuke shelo yomru chozer bar HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitzvah zu. But other than that, they can do whatever they want. As they put over here, Shitas Harashba, Shelamigdar Milsa, Yesh Koach B'yad Chachamim, La'akor Davar Minator B'kum Va'aseh, even an act of commission. V'hainu, Shebekadei Sheneshos Yisrael, Lo Yitnu Einem Ba'acher, V'yomer Nit Mesi, in order to prevent the Jewish wife from getting out of the marriage by saying Nit Mesi, Tiknu Chachamim, the Rashba says, Sha'afim Tomer Kein Te Mutereslo, you can't get more explicit than that. Really, 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 she should be also to him. The Chacham say, we're misakin, that she's not. As far as I know, this is the most expansive assertion of judicial power in rabbinical thought on record. The sages can do as they wish with the Taryag mitzvahs. They can order not only acts of omission, Shev Val Taisa, that there's a lot of, we know that, right? You don't blow Shov, you don't take lulav, I mean, all that stuff. They can even order acts of commission. They can even say, Kum Vaseh, do something the Torah prohibits. In other words, they could legislate that from now on, everybody should eat ham, if that's what they came up with. Obviously for a good reason, for Migdal Milza, but still. This is why, in recent history, when the state of Israel came into being, Rabbi Maimon, the head of the Mizrahi, wanted to revive the Sanhedrin, and it was a whole tumult and everything. And people said, "Revive the Sanhedrin? how should I put it? That's going to be terrible. They'll cancel laws in the Torah and all the rest of it. And some people say, well, the Sanhedrin can't do that. But the Talmidei Chacham said, it's actually according to Rashba, they can. They can do whatever they want. So if Ben Gurion tells them, they were afraid. If Ben Gurion tells them, they'll cancel Shabbos. They can do whatever they want. Anyway, this is obviously a big chiddush, this Rashba. The Ran and other Rishonim disagree. They hold that this is only allowed for omission or for or for temporary commission. You can do the Sanhedrin can be misakin sheval taisa, and they can be misakin kum va'aseh temporarily, what we call hara shah, but only temporarily, not permanently, but not for permanent commission. And here he's saying they can. Tosfos seems to say the same thing as the Rashba. Tosfos says, "Minerally, the kivan sheyesh lachush shema nosno eineho ba'acher yesh koch biyad chachamim lakor dvorel mikol v'kol b'svar gedola kazos." So it seems we have a principled machlokas rishonim over how much power the rabbis have. It certainly doesn't seem through Shas that they use this sweeping power whenever a problem presents itself. In fact, as far as I can see, this is the only example, or maybe two examples, I know of Jewish history, where they did a kumbase mikano haba. One would be this, Tamei Aniloch, and the other one, as far as I can see, is when they say you can write down the Torah Shabbat Peh, Eis Las Hashem Efir Torah Secha, which is permanent. Okay. Now, personally, me, myself, and I, as I say, because of my history predilection, I see this Rashba a little bit differently. And basically, the Rashba doesn't say it's permanent. He says they made such a takana. It could be that they said now that the door is full of priestess. I'm just making this up. We're misakin that now when you say Tmei Aniloch and we don't believe you, but if the generation will get better, another generation later or two or three, we'll go back to the original rule. In other words, maybe it was a hara shah just of a long term. I don't know. I'm just, that's what it seems to me. Now, in point of fact, historically, this din was never revoked. This Mishnah Achrona is still in rule today. You can check it out. It's still in the Shulchan Aruch, in Even Ezer Kuf Tes Vav Siv Vav. And, but maybe that's because there's no Sanhedrin anymore to change the law, or maybe because public morals never changed. I don't know. That's one way. There's another way also of explaining this ruling, not mentioned by Rishonim, but by Achronim here and there. This is the opinion of Yonasan Eibshitz, in the famous Bnei Ahuva, his sefer on the Rambam, which is more chiddishdik. It essentially interprets the rule of Ein Davar Shebe'erba Pachas Mishnayim in a radical manner to mean that if there aren't two witnesses who actually saw the wife and the lover in bed together, it not only means that the case is not actionable, it means no Isser was actually generated by their intercourse. She's not a surah to her husband at all. It was on this basis, I recall, that the Ben Ish Chai and Rav Polim disagreed with the Nodar Yehuda, because he had that famous case in Orach Chaim Lamed Hey, where this guy confessed to the Nodar Yehuda. It's very famous. You've heard of it. And he said, I was Zana with this Eish for 3 years, and now I see I've done wrong, and the question is, should I tell the husband? To force. There were no Edom. They got away with it. He was just, coming clean and confessing. And, it's a question of Kavod Abriya, Skadol Kavod Abriya, Dochalas Eshabatara. And the Nodar Yehuda in the end, after going back and forth through all the sugya, says you have to tell. But the Ben Ish Chai says you don't have to tell. It's in the Rav Polim at the very beginning of Even Ezer. And the reason is, he said, you got the Bnei Ahuva, which says that there's no Isser if the husband doesn't know. So if you don't tell the husband he doesn't know, there's no Isser. It's not like you're responsible for the guy sinning unknowingly, the husband. He doesn't know, so there's no Isser. I said this morning, I saw in Sternbuch in the Chuvas Van Hogas, his response book in volume 3, he talks about this, Bnei Ahuva, in regard to the Bali Tshuva in Israel and South Africa. Imagine a couple, there's very low Isa, that they become from. Now, all right, they married for 15 years now, they became religious. Shomer Shabbos, all the rest of it. Well, until now, they weren't Shomer Shabbos. And until now, she lived a certain lifestyle and he lived a certain lifestyle. Let's say she lived a certain lifestyle. So the bottom line is, she messed around. And the bottom line is, really, she's usher to her husband. But that'd be almost counterintuitive. Here, as a couple, they both joined together, become From and Shomer Shabbos, and the first thing you tell them is you have to get divorced. Because while you were married, like in Israel, where they had a real chuppah kedushin, you fooled around. Really? And so if you look in Sternbuch, and Chuvas Hanhagas, he has a whole long attempt to try to make some kind of an argument that they could stay married. And he uses this B'nai Ahuva. Anyway, so in our case of Tamei Ani Loch, the Chachamim can legislate not to believe her without any problems. In other words, they can say that she really wasn't a Shaban Avshachatichi Yisura. Right? She's not Aser, if you go like the B'nai Ahuva. When I was looking around in different Sfarim for this, like the Mesiftas and elsewhere, I see everybody's quoting the Malbusha Yontif in the footnotes. I said, Malbusha Yontif, what is that? Okay? That he has a lot to say in this sugya. You know, in the bottom of the Ritvas, and the bottom of the Mesiftas, and the bottom of the Rashbas, and all this. What is this? I have to confess, I didn't really know what a Malbusha Yontif is. Turns out, the Shalos and Chuvas Malbusha Yontif was a big Litvish Shagon in the 19th century. He lived from the 1820s, 1890s. And he was the Rav in Mir, where the Mir Yeshiva was. He wasn't in the Yeshiva, he was the Rav of the Shtat. And he seems to have been, like at the top level, like Yitzhak Elchanan and all that. The big biggies. And it's interesting, I looked up a little bit, and he was famous in his day for being Mr. Kutchim. Here's the Chavetz Chaim biography, translated, by the Art Scroll. And we all know the Chavetz Chaim got into Kutchim. He started more or less the modern revival interest in Kutchim, the Brisk. And he says over here that in the old days before the Chavetz Chaim came along, only rare exceptional individuals were into Kutchim. The Chavetz Chaim once related that on one occasion he had a long conversation on topics of Torah with the great Talmud Chacham Rabbi Eliezer Moshe Halevi Hurwitz of Pinsk, and was impressed that the Rabbi Eliezer Halevi Hurwitz was such a bucking Kutchim, which was unusual. The Chavetz Chaim asked the scholar of Pinsk if he knew anyone else who was also big into Kutchim, and the answer was, Rab Lipa of Mir is more fluent than I am in Kutchim. Even if he had his eyes closed, he could do the avoda without a single mistake. Okay? Rab Lipa of Mir is the Malbusha Yontif. Now, this has nothing to do with Kutchim. These are solid shilos, halacha l'maisa, in Ebenezer and Yerodea. Okay? Now, heavy duty stuff, achosha mishpat. Heavy duty stuff. And he has in here a long treatment of this subject because of a Maaseh Shahaya, which by no means is unique. If you know anything about the responsa literature, this scenario, this sad scenario, happened not rarely. Okay? Yeah, I wrote it down. It's in Simon Zion. Let's see here. The Malbush. Here we go. Sheila Mirav Echad, Odos Hamaisa Narosha Vispivo Sab Bixara. Here's the case. Ish Kohen Echad Sacher Malamed. This happened in Lithuania. So family, poor family, hired a Malamed for their kids. And the poor, it's a small house, everybody sleeps in one room. And 3 days after Malamed moved in with the family, the wife asked the husband, was that you who was with me last night when we were intimate? And the husband says, it wasn't me. Maybe he had some imagination. Achi Toshiv, Keshev Amrlo, Bidmo Shlish, But she said no. And she started crying heavily. There was somebody there. It wasn't imagination. So they could tell there's only one other person here that the Muhammad did it with her last night. Keep it base. He's the only other person. And next night, near them, happened again. The couple went to sleep. And the Malamed walked over to her bed in the middle of the night, in the dark. And touched her head. As soon as she realized it's not her husband, she started screaming in the middle of the night, you're not my husband. And she screamed and screamed until everybody woke up. And the Malam was caught red-handed by the two of them. Right? How could you do a thing like this? Because I'm a Kohen, and you gave in, and you're going to wreck a family. I'm going to divorce. You're murdering a family who has 5 children over here. It's all in here, right? And the guy, by the way, says like this. The Heishel Lahem, and the Malamed said like this. Not my fault. The devil made me do it. Like Flip Wilson. Nu, ich bin a river gefallen. Mo ese, ki lo yicholti. I fell into the Yetzer Hara. Ki lo yicholti, lamod al yitzri, ki gover alai. And he hit the road. Terrible scenario. And you find this not rarely, I'm sorry to say. I don't know if Yehuda has a case like this. I think Simon Ayin maybe, the Ebenezer. And the Chavos Yair has a case like this. And you have something similar case in the Archoner. Not exactly, but something similar. In other words, this is a sad part of reality. Okay? So now what do you do? How do you clean up the mess? And so the local rabbi says, I'm sending it up to the Malbusha Yantav, because it's Rab Lippman, Yantav Lippman Basliansky of Mir is the Malbusha Yantav. And he obviously is one of the big Gedolim. And he's got a long 30, 35 page thing over here going up and down through this whole sugya of Tmei Anilo. It's unbelievable. It's this Shita, and then this Shita, see over here, Shita Velezim admits the second way of learning it, and the Tosas and the Rosh, and the Rajba. It's unbelievable. It's like a book by itself. It's like a treatise on its own, because he's trying to find a heter. All right? If possible. The couple shouldn't have to divorce over what's an unbelievable victimization. And the guy said, the devil made me do it. Right? And look what you're leaving behind. So that's the Malbusha Yantav. Okay? Now, the truth is, this Gemara is at the end of Nidrim. Same thing. It's a lady who used to wash her husband's. This is more at the end of the Nidrim. Wash her husband's hands after they did it, and then one day she came to wash his hands, and he said, we weren't together last night. And then she said, must have been one of the goyim in the neighborhood. And they said, we don't believe you because it's Tmei Aniloch, and and therefore we don't believe you. And there was another case like that also, that Hayit said is La Bedicha Daita B'Havi Gavra, same thing. She was frowning at her husband. You didn't treat me right last night. And he said, we weren't even together last night. Must have been one of the goyim. These cases apparently happen. Okay? Now, as I said, the Malbusha Yantav, Shalos and Shuv's Malbusha Yantav, has 30 pages on this sugya. This really book should be reprinted in modern format with footnotes. It's really, I'll tell you the truth, I never knew much about it. It's very impressive. He's really one of the big Gedolim. I look around some of the other Chuvas. He is a king of this literature. But okay, doesn't need my Haskalah. And he has a longer, detailed, really close analysis of every one of the Shittas, including what I call the 2 90s. Nidrim 90 and Yavamas 90. Nidrim Daf Tzadi and Yavamas Daf Tzadi. That's where they have a lot of the stuff that's nogea to this. Nidrim Daf Tzadi is what I just read you about Tmei Aniloch and Mishnah Rishon and Mishnah Achrona. In Yavamas Daf 90, Daf Tzadi, there's a whole discussion of Bezin, Mashtin, Lakar, Dam, and Torah, and its Gedarim. What is the power, exactly our question, of Bezin to uproot or cancel or temporarily cancel or override a deraisa? Sheval Taisa Kumva say yes to Gemara. This is where the Rishonim go to town and fight it out. So, for example, according to Malbusha Yontif, the Ramban disagrees with the Rashba in the following scenario. The case where the public has not yet started to go off the derech, but there's a strong possibility that they will shortly commence to do so. The Ramban asserts that Yomar Yavamis 90 affords the sages the power to change the laws even if the public has not yet begun to misbehave. Whereas the Rashba, on the other hand, holds that the Chacham can only act if the Nisfar Nispartsu, if the public has already started to misbehave. These are all interesting scenarios. Now, what exactly is this Gemara in Yevamah society? It turns out there's a major machlokas Rishonim and maybe a machlokas Achronim over whether the Sanhedrin can go this far. And as far as I can see, rather than being based on a svara, it seems to be based on how you translate a certain phrase in the Brisa, the Sifri. The Gemara there discusses Yevamah Tzadiyam Beis, the authority of a Navi to do an act of commission, but he uses the Brisa on the unclear formula. In other words, as I'm sure many of you know, Eliyahu HaNavi Bahar Carmel is a famous case of what we call Hora Shah, because on the one hand, the halach is midaraisa, you're not allowed to do karbanis outside the base of Migish once it's built. On the other hand, Eliyahu offered a karbanis as famous in the story when he's fighting the Nevi Abal on Mount Carmel, and the fire comes down and burns it and all that sort of thing. How could he do karbanis outside the base of Mikdash? It's the case, okay? And the Gemara in Nidrim, Gemara in Yevamah says as follows: Toshma, a love tishma'un. The pasuk says in Devarim about a navi, a love tishma'un, listen to him. Afilu omer lecha al achas mikol mitzvahs shebetorah. Even if he says avor, be over one of the mitzvahs of the Torah, Gagun Eliyahu Bar Carmel, hakol lefi shah. Now, what does the words mean? What does hakol lefi shah mean? Does it mean temporary? In other words, Eliyahu HaNavi has the power to do a kumvaseh on a temporary basis, like a one-time thing, which is what happened with Eliyahu, but not permanently. That's how the Rambam learns it, as we know in Hilchos Yisodei Torah. Maybe you've seen it. The Rambam actually says, "Ilu shalu es Eliyahu v'amrulo." If they would have asked Eliyahu, the Rambam says, "Nakor mashe kazav b'Torah b'tal esel b'chol makom asher tereh." Are we uprooting? Are we getting rid of the Torah law that you're only permitted to offer karbanos in the base of Mikdash, and we're getting rid of that? Eliyahu would have replied, no. Whoever offers a carbon outside the base of Mikdash is chayav kares. K'moshe tzibah Moshe. Avol ani akriv b'chutz b'dvar Hashem kei l'hakish nivi abal. But me, as a hora shah, and I'm a navi, because Hashem told me to, and in order to defend the Jewish religion, on a special emergency one-time basis, I repeat, one-time basis, I can do it. But chutz from that, you can't. If other Nevi'im would say that we're telling you to do a hora shah and to be over on something temporarily, mitzvah lishmo b'hem. However, if they say we're canceling this law and this law no longer applies, mikanal haba, misosam b'chenek, then they're chayav misa, because you can't get rid permanently of any law in the Torah. Shatorah amr lo nevolenu adolam. That's the Rambam. On the other hand, other Rishonim interpret lefi shah, and the Hebrew is ambiguous, to mean not lefi shah temporarily, but we are legislating to override what the Torah says because of the shah, because of the needs of the time, because of social changes and policy, because of the needs of the time. In other words, the impetus for changing the law, even a kumvaseh, even do something that Torah doesn't allow you to do, is something in contemporary reality. The impetus for changing the law is something contemporary reality. In the case of Eliyahu, the problem was a rampant idolatry. The Gemara says that. So the times require it, the Chacham can change and abolish the laws even permanently. Now, the Gemara in Yevamos rejects the proof from Eliyahu because it was a special situation. In other words, you can't bring a proof from Eliyahu either way because it's a special situation. Migdar Milsa shiny. It was, because of an emergency. The Gemara goes on to adduce a source for the sweeping power of the sages, not a Novi, but the Chachamim, to do this from a different famous brisa. Tashma, this is in Yevamos. That the Bezin can do punishments even against the Torah law. Not to violate the Torah, but because of a siyog. No, it's for policy reason. So a guy went riding out in public on Shabbos, which is a drabonim, and they stoned him. So you can't do that. Not because he deserved to be stoned, because it's not a chayiv misa what he did, right? And it wasn't Einim Asra and all the rest of it. There wasn't chayiv misa, but they did it in other words, for emergency regulations because of social policy. We want to stamp out Chil Shabbos. And there was a guy and his wife that did it in public under a tree. In other words, they had relations right out of Rashus Rabbim, and they were both whipped. They get malchus. Because it doesn't say we're in the Torah, you can't do it in public, but kula hide, and therefore they said we're not going to allow this, and they beat the heck out of them. So there's no Navi here, just the Chachamim, and executing somebody they stoned him as a kumasei, right? Because the Torah says you can't kill somebody without due process, and they did. And nevertheless, we do it, so it seems to prove the sages have the power to cancel a Torah law. What is the nature, what's the gather of this power? The Rajba says the following. It's not simply the Chacham have the power arbitrarily to get rid of a Torah law. One of the mitzvahs in the Torah is to listen to the Shofet at that time. And if the Shofet, the Dayanim, the Sanhedrin, whatever you're going to call it, sees the Hatir, the Tzorach, Mutim Torah, they can do it. And that's what they did in the Nidrim when they say that she said to me, Aniloch, she said I was mizana with somebody or raped by somebody, and we know she's telling the truth, and nevertheless we don't believe her. Since they had a reason because of preachers and all this, Mishur Migdar Milsa Shalote Kolachas Omeres Tmei Anochim Afkas Has Miyad Bailo Omdu V'Godru V'Hisnu Sha'afilu Hikid Voreha She'etei Muteres Miyad Bailo Mitruma. Even the Chacham made a rule that even if she's telling the truth, if she's telling the truth, she should be also the Kohen. She remains married to the Kohen. That's the power that they have. This is very interesting. The Rajba is saying that there is a hierarchy in mitzvahs, which, I guess we know that because there's a rule called Asi Dochalos say, but nevertheless, one of the hierarchies is the overriding mitzvah of El HaShofet HaShayih B'Yom HaHaim. In other words, V'asisa al pi hadavar she'yagidu l'cha min ha'makam hu HaShayih V'chashem v'shamarta l'asas kichol HaShayih Yerucha. I repeat, kichol HaShayih Yerucha, whatever they tell you. This is interesting because there are chakiras among the Achronim. Basically, what's the story with Kichol HaShayih Yerucha? In other words, what's the story with an Isser that was trumped by Kichol HaShayih Yerucha? Let me read it. Yesh lachkor begeder akiras davar aydei takanas chachamim. Ha'im rabbonim bitlu es gufa mitzvah, or was there a deraisa v'yachto achar takona shuv enkan mitzvah or is there klal af mederaisa? Is it the pshat that once the chachamim say we're canceling this law, then there is no law like that anymore? So in other words, in our case, it's hutra. If they say Tamei ani lochin in the menace, she's not listening to her husband. The Isser is canceled. That's their power. It's not simply they override it. They can nuke it. They can cancel it. Okay? Or, right? Osher Rabbanan lo bitlu a gufa deraisa. El shetiknu shelo l'kaim is a deraisa. V'yato menes hakonis chacham neged a shed Rabbanan adif al deraisa. Me'achar shezen nichal b'tziva shel Torah l'shmo divrei chachamim. V'rama Torah l'shmo divrei chachamim. Av kasher divrei boim keneged Torah. So in English, what is the status of an Isser trumped by a case of Kechol Yerucha, like our case? Is the Isser nuked by the ruling of the sages? Is it Batal? Is it Hutra, no longer in existence? Or is it rather Dechuya, trumped, overborne, but still in existence? In my opinion, this Chakira is manifest in the above-mentioned opposing Shittas of the Ramban and the Rashba, as explained by the Malbusha Yontif, regarding the expansive authority of a Beis or Navi to do a Oker Doverman HaTorah B'Kumase L'Doras permanently. According to Ramban, if you'll remember, he holds that they can legislate this even if the people have not yet begun to misbehave. Kodem Shenis Partzu. But it looks like they will misbehave unless the certain Torah law is canceled. In other words, it's preventative. If the Torah authorities feel that they have good and sufficient grounds for preventative canceling, they can do so. By contrast, the Rashba holds these authorities can only cancel only if there's an actual outbreak of misbehaving that's already occurred. Only if the people are sinning may the authorities go so far as to be Okar Dovman Torah B'Kum V'Asei L'Doros. Doesn't that sound like the Ramban is going with Hutra and the Rashba is going with Dechuya? That's what it sounds to me, right? In other words, Shittas Ramban, Shalateretz HaGemara Yesh Koch Biad Chachamim Lakor Dovman Torah Gami B'Poel Lonis Partzu, right? Lonis Partzu Bavera El Shechoshishin Shenis Partzu. L'Rashba Rak Acher Shenis Partzu Bavera Kol Chacham Ladin Avalo Kom Shenis Partzu. So it sounds one's Hutra, one's Nechuya. Anyway, let me come to my own history thoughts. You know me. I ask myself, do we know when this Mishnah Achrona of disbelieving the woman was legislated? Disbelieving the Ashes Kohen? Not really. Well, in what era would it make sense? I suppose in an era of declining morals, right? When do we have evidence of such a phenomenon? Well, one era that comes to mind is Hanukkah, the Greek and Hellenistic persecution, which definitely had a sexually immoral aspect to them, right? I mean, wasn't that the time of Esish Ish Tibor Lehegman Tchila? The Greek guys used to do it first. May I point out that the Megillah's Tainus says that was the reason for the Maccabean revolt. Just think of the effect that phenomenon, Esish Ish Tibor Lehegman Tchila, including Kohen, just to think of the effect that had on public morals. And indeed, the Gemara Avodah Zarah Lamed Vav says, it was the Beis Shel Chashmonai, Gazru Yisrael Abola Goy Chai Mishum Nashkaz, that they issued laws against Yisrael who had relations with a Goya, which sounds like until then they need to do it. They gave him a din of Nashkaz, Nida Shepcha Goya of Oved Iskacham and Zona. This suggests to me the strong possibility that the decline in female morals, or perhaps Jewish women who wanted out from their promiscuous husbands, was a feature of the troubled Maccabean Hasmonean times. On Hanukkah, we constantly on the dreidel, on the latkes, but it was a bummer. Eshes ish tibor lehegman tchila. Okay? So, it was really a problem. Now, what is the most famous and controversial Arayos episode of that era? As far as I can think, the famous case of Yanai or John Hyrcanus in Kedushin 66, where the yichus of the Kohen Gadol was impugned. The Gemara says it's famous. Ma'aseh b'Yanai Amelach Shalach al Kochlish of a Midbar. That happened once Yanai, but even though they call him Yanai, it's really Yochanan Kohen Gadol. It's really the father of Yanai. In other words, not King Alexander Daneus, but his father John Hyrcanus, who was the famous Kohen Gadol and conqueror. And it says that he conquered 60 cities. They made a big party that they describe at great length. They ate cheap food on golden plates and so forth. And John Hyrcanus, right? Had a bad friend named Elazar ben Poira, and he said, Yanei Amelch lim shel Prushim alecha. The Prushim, the rabbis, don't like you. They have kindness on you. Moaz said, how can I find out? He said, put on the tzitz. That'll take them off. And he wasn't going to go. So he put on the tzitz, Bein Einov. There was a real Haredi kanoi there, named Yehuda ben Gedidya, and he said to Yanei Melch, Rav loch keser malchus, hanach keser kahuna lezar shalaron. It's enough that you're a king. Leave the kahuna to a real Kohen. Whoa, what is this? He's a Kohen Gadol. Shayu omrim, because the rumor was, imo nishbis b'modiin, that the mother of John Hyrcanus, the mother of Kohen Gadol, mother of Yavon Kohen Gadol, the wife of Shimon HaMaccabee, his brother Judah Maccabee, had been a shavuya in the town of Modim. In other words, the Greeks had captured Modim, and she was there, and so forth. And the Gemara goes on to say that an investigation was made, and there was no evidence for it whatsoever. Maybe it was trey v'trey, maybe it's Zedis Mecheshes, the Gemara has all, that's the lumdus, so what happened. But in Lamaisa, there was no halachic proof that anything was wrong. And the party broke up in anger, and by the time it's over, he killed all the Chachamim. That's the famous story where he says, Al Talmud Atzchav Yom Moscha, Sha'yochun Kohen Gadol Kol Yom Ben Aprushim, B'Sof Yom Ben Atzedukim. This is the incident that ticked it off. And he killed out all the sages. That's why, what's his name? Yeshua, not Yeshua ben Prachia. Maybe it was Yeshua ben Prachia. Had to run away to Alexandria, and only when John Hyrcanus died, he came back. It's a famous story. That's the Yeshu story, by the way. Okay, fine. Now, what exactly happened over here? John Hyrcanus was accused of being a chalal. How so? Shahayu omrim imo nishbas mamodim. Right? They said his mother had been a shvuya, a captive in Modim when it was occupied by the Greeks, which is interesting because in rabbinic literature, they don't talk about Modin as far as I know, being their Maccabee headquarters. That's in the book of Maccabees. They usually have something else, but leave that alone. As such, Rashi says it was Krach Shel Chashmono, just from the history point of view. As such, she had been a Shavuya, and a Shavuya may not marry or remain married to a Kohen. The answer is Midrabanan, not Deraisa. It's only Midraisa if she admits that she was raped, or she denies it, but there are two Adam that she had to be with a guy. For whatever reason, Rashi says here in Kedushin that she had been a Shavuya, they said, before she married her husband, Shimon Maccabee. Haprushim hayu omrim olav, imo nishbis mamodiin, Rashi says, kerach shel beis chashmonai haya, it was a Maccabean stronghold, u'shvuya psula kuhuna, u'nesa aviv v'nimtza chol. And subsequent to that, after she'd been a Shvuya, Shimon Maccabee married her, and John Hyrcanus is the son. Personally, me, myself, and I, it seems more like she'd been a captive. Imo Nishma, it sounds she was captive after she was already married. It even sounds like they're saying the father was a Greek. He said, Hanach Keser Kahuna Lazar Shel Aaron. Ooh, that's a shtach. Knows you're not even a Kohen. But let's go with Rashi, okay? Let's go with Rashi. Rabbi Akiva Eiger's medayik from Rashi that had she been married at the time of the captivity, the Prushim would not have impugned him. Knows Rashi's medayik. He said it happened before, which is certainly how it sounds from Rashi. But why? John Hyrcanus would have been born from a bia with a pre-existing husband, Shimon Maccabee, subsequent to her captivity, and that would make her a machol, wouldn't it? No, what does it matter, when the marriage took place, if he was born from Cohen, Shimon Maccabee, and the wife had at any time prior to his birth, prior to his conception, been with a guy, he'd be a chol. Rabbi Akiva Eiger says, Im Hoysa Nishbas Lachash Nesah is a lumdus. had the Shivuya, had she been captured after she was an Ashes Cohen, and had she remained married to him, which she did, then that would be equivalent to her saying, you say I was a captive, I say I wasn't. Because how could she stay married to the husband? And it'd be one against one, and he would be canceled. But Rabbi Kiva says like that since the Edis was concerning an act that happened before she was married, Felici she saw so, and she never went ahead and denied it at the time. So that why she be also, I mean, I would say the fact that she went on and married a Kohen would be like a chasha, but whatever. But I asked myself, why did a frum guy like Shimon Maccabee, who went on to become the Kohen Gadol, by the way, want to marry her? This question leads me to suggest that this is precisely the Tekufa when they issued the ruling of Mishnah Achrona, Omeres Tmei Ani Lecha in a Nemenis. Either in the time of John Hyrcanus or immediately before it, in the Maccabean era. Okay? Think about it. It was a toxic situation for Kohanim in general. This Gzeira of Tiboy Lehegman Tchila. Plenty of Kohanim were affected, were victims of this decree. There's a lot about this in the Yerushalmi Ksubis, by the way. In Halacha Hey. The Gemara there at the beginning of Ksubis says there were all kinds of female Jewish reactions to this Gzeira. There were the Tzenuos, but there were also the Prutzos. Right? Remember? And indeed, we all remember the case at the end of Sukkah about Miriam Bas Bilgad that she whacked the Mizbeach with her sandal, and she said, Lucas, she was an Ashes Cohen or Bas Cohen or whatever. They ran off with a Greek. She went off to there. She's a Prutza. So here's what I think would happen. The Kohanim, like Shimon Maccabee, wanted to marry their marasa, their betrothed, their fiancés. If Shimon Maccabee had just been an emotionless halachic frummi, why would he want to marry anybody that didn't even have the slightest questionability of any sort? People have feelings, right? Human beings. What did you see the case in the Malbusha Yantov? She said, you're like killing me if you make me get divorced. It's like death. And same thing in the Noda Behuda. He says, Hamavis, you can't separate me from my husband and family. You can't do that to me. It's like killing me. They were into it, okay? So anyway, now what took place, I asked myself, after the Jewish victory? This is the part of Hanukkah we don't think about. Well, the phenomena of Tibola Hegman had been around. The Tzenuos, by definition, did the right thing, and they said to their intendants, Tamei Ani Lecha, I was going to marry you, you're a Kohen, Arison, or just engaged. Can't do it. I was violated by a guy. I'm a victim. It's not my fault, but now she's a Tzenua. She knows the din. I said, I have to move on in my life and get remarried to a Yisrael. Right? They bore the consequences, divorcing their husband. Remember, the Mishnah says in the Durham, you do get your ksuva. Because she's a victim. It wasn't Barasa. She didn't do anything wrong. She's a victim. So you collect your ksuva. So there's no financial downside. But she can't stay married to the Kohen. That's the Tzenuos. But there are also Prutzis, which is a description of a certain type of girl. Priestess. Now, how did this priestess manifest itself in that era? Several ways. One way was like the Gemara says in Ksubas, they cohabited willingly with the Greek hegemons. Baruchs and opponents. You can't what's the right word? Blame somebody living in that Tekufa. The other type of Prutzis were the wives of Kohanim who did not cohabit with the hegemons, but said they did in order to get out of their marriages to their unwanted Kohen husbands. Because Eineho Nostab Acher. In other words, it was a case of clever, audacious, outrageous, cynical opportunism. The old story, but in the aftermath of Gzeira Tibal Hegman Tchila, when so many women, including the Shei Kohanim, were coming out and confessing and collecting their ksuba, by the way, it was easy to make such claims without opprobrium. In other words, there was no downside, no forfeiture of ksuba, so it was tempting to just lie and get divorced and marry the guy you want to. And there was no shame and saying Tamei Aniloch in that era, in that Kufa, it happened to everybody. It was like after the Holocaust. I said before, in the Igros Moshe, or maybe it's Ushri, maybe it's a case, a lady, like in Bar Park, seriously. She had like over here a tattoo, and from the SS, and she'd been used as a zona in their brothels. In other words, by force, obviously. From lady, it was terrible. And her children say you should get that tattoo removed or something like that. And I think it was Moshe Feinstein, maybe it was Ushri. He said, what do you have to get rid of it for? You didn't do anything wrong. It's actually a sign that you suffered Al Kiddush Hashem. You did nothing wrong. You have nothing to be ashamed of. You understand? So it's a different tekufa. I mean, there were terrible times for the Jewish people. These prutsos cynically leveraged their status as Neshei Kohanim because they knew any bia with a Greek was enough to get themselves a divorce, even if it was onus. They didn't have to prove it was Ratzon. This is understandable. Times like these often result in priests. My father, today's my father's yahrzeit, told me, I know from other places also, in the DP camps after the Second World War, it was a bad Gilerai situation because people are coming off the Holocaust and they were all messed up. And without going into details, a lot of bad stuff was going on, which is why the rabbis and others encouraged everybody to get married. You understand? To a lot of people, maybe those of you listening to me, parents and grandparents, they could have got married at 15, 16, 17 years old. 18 years old, I'm serious. There's a lot of that because, okay, you're free now and from the camps, all the resident. Don't go down this derech. Get married, chuppah kedushin, and have regular. You understand? So the aftermath of a Holocaust, and that's what you had in Hanukkah, a certain type of Holocaust, is this kind of terrible business. The times were not normal. Chazal did not like what the Prutzes were doing. It seems it was widespread. Some Rishonim say it was Rov Nosha. So they passed the Mishnah Achrona at the end of the Nidrim, which by definition has to be low plug, because how do you know who's telling the truth? Even the Tzenuos from now on would be disbelieved under the authority of the Rashba, as we say. It was in this atmosphere that the John Hyrcanus incident occurred. Now understand well, this was an extraordinary point in halachic history. As far as I know, this was the first time in the aftermath of Hanukkah that a Torah law was canceled. I mean, kum vasei l'doros, right? And as I told you before, maybe one other time, as far as I can think, with the Eis Las Hashem Mefer Torah Second, when they let you write that in the Torah Shabbat Balpet, that's rare. This is the case I'm talking about. It's the first time. I mean, kum vasei l'doros. The other cases that you find were either Shev al Taseh or Kum Vasei L'Shah, but not L'Doros. The controversial part, of course, was that it's Tzenuos. I mean, they were presumably not lying, and they were told to stay with their husbands, Nisu and Erison, and they were told their children will not be Chalolim, even though everybody knew they ought to be Chalolim, because of the Greeks. It was a revolution in the priestly caste that must have been painful to the old line Kohanim, and the old line Frumis in general. The only Chalolim from the Greek situation were children of women whose cohabitation was witnessed by Adam, or at least had been an actual captive, and not just a suffix feka, whatever. Now, in the case of John Hyrcanus, there was 0 Adis on the cohabitation. The mother was accused of being a shvuya. Nobody saw Bia. Okay? Now, John Hyrcanus obviously figured, because he blew up, even if my mother would say, Tamei ani l'cha, she would be disbelieved, because of the plug. And now these guys are claiming, with no evidence whatsoever, that she was a shavuya, because they said, Imun nishbas b'modin. And based on that, they want to defrock me? Right? And without Adis, by the way, suspects she doesn't do all. Only later on in time, Yochum ben Zakkai did they say it's also by Shavuya. And the story's not even true. My mother's a Tzenua. If there had been any cohabitation, if there had been any captivity, she would not have married my father, and my father would not have married her. They're from people. Remember the Ramban in Vayechi, Parsh Vayechi, famous Ramban about the Maccabees. He describes the 5 Maccabee brothers, which means the father of John Hyrcanus, as super frum in terms of halachic observance. The Ramban says, Arba b'nei Chashmonai hazakin shamochu b'vayis sheni hoyu chasidei elyon v'ilmoi heim nishtachu atorah hamitzvos miYisrael. Think about that. V'al became then Jewish gadol because they took the melucha. Now, if I'm right about the time period of Mishnah Achrona, which Sanhedrin, which Beis Din HaGadol would have been the one that legislated this? The one presided over John Hyrcanus himself, or maybe his father, like by Demai, because Yochanan Kohen Gadol was the head of Sanhedrin. Who made Demai? You know this. It's a Yochanan Kohen Gadol, meaning he was, among other things, the Kohen Gadol, he was a general, the king, and the head of Sanhedrin. So maybe some Pharisee, some Frumi Prushim felt he was responsible for this legal change. Remember, this is the first time he ever changed the law permanently in order to cover up some dirt about his own mother. I don't know what they said about it. All we know is, meaning they departed, and the party broke up with John Hyrcanus being angry. I mean, it's not like they apologized, and he ended up killing them. This we know. Let me say that this suggested scenario is not without precedent. I am thinking of the famous Gzeira of Vienna of 1422, the Wiener Gzeira, when you had the community attacked and many of the men were burned at the stake. If you go to Vienna, you can see it. And the women were taken, and each woman in 1422 was put as a captive in a Geisha house, and the Geisha family says to work on them to make them Catholic. And some did, most didn't, and they got away one way or the other over a period of time. But the problem was they had been Shvuyas. And maybe they were Mizana with the captors, Barotzon or Bashogeg, and there were those rabbis in Germany said they can't go back to their families, which is a bummer gadol, because here you just went through a terrible Yisurin, you were torn for your family, your family was killed and tortured and so forth, and you yourself were put into like a Catholic torture thing to make you convert, and you were one of the brave ones who did, and now you come back to your family, and they say you can't get, you have to get divorced. And so the Gedolim of Ashkenaz said at the time, this is from the reports, that they're allowed to return to their husbands despite them having been shvuyas of the Christian burghers of Vienna for extended periods of time. If you read the Trumas Hadeshen, the Reish Memal, and the Trumas Hadeshen, his parents were in this. He lived in the next generation. You'll see they even were mater the Shei Kohanim, which makes no sense. In other words, maybe you can make an argument that if anything happened, these women were from, so it was Ba'onis and not Baratzin. They didn't willingly go along. But with Ashes Coin, it doesn't matter. Okay? In the case of the other women, there was room within Talmudic law to argue they had not willingly cohabited with their Viennese captors. But by the Cohen wives, it didn't matter. So how could they be mater? The Trumas Hadeshen, who lived a little after that time, twists and turns to argue and make the case, and he was a great gadol and an ancestor of mine, that the Kohen wives never cohabited at all with their captors. Not a single one of them, he says. It strains credulity, but at least it's as far to Taina, no bia took place. I mean, I understand if you can make that argument, then they can go back to their husband. By contrast, the Ramah in the Darkei Moshe, a century later, doesn't say the women were believed not to have been violated. Rather, he says they did have cause kedushin. The Ramah says, "Linira da gedolim she'etiru lav medino el mitzur shum tzarach shah." That the reason they were matam to go back to their family was like a tzarach shah. Shera'u sheish chas v'shalom lachush la'osei l'noshim. You have to worry what will end up with these Jewish women. They count too. Shem yedu shelo yachzor l'bal nereim. If they are told they can't go back to their family, shelo yikalkalu. Maybe they'll go off to derech. They'll convert to Christian. They'll say, I'm doomed anyway. Heck with it. I might as well go and marry a guy and live a Christian life. That's where they would make them. The Ramah says, what do you do with the fact that, let's say, Eishes Yisrael, and she did it Baratzon? Second. Yeah. What if Beis Yisrael did baratzim? Or what if it was Ashes Cohen and did it in bonus? She's also. What do you do with that? Nearly, the Ramah says, I think the Samcha Hadar Amrina called Makash Adonam Kaddish that they rely on Afkos Kedushim. The Eshbezim Afkoi Kedushim Avik Penuyas. Va'avim Zonim Muteres Labanein Keilir. So therefore, if you do Afkos Kedusha, you retroactively annul the marriage, then even if they were resounded with the Christian captors, it won't count now. So in other words, this is a different approach altogether. By the time of the Ramah, Afkos Kedusha wasn't even practiced. So it's very unusual to say that they did it. But anyway, it was a special psach, Mishum Tzorech Hashal, because of the crisis. Of course, the problem with the Ramah is, what do you do with the wife of the Kohen? Right? Like I said before, even if it was ba'onus, if they were violated ba'onus, they're still also to their husbands. So how do you get around it? There are two ways that I know of answering the question. One is famous answer of Rav Herzog and Avad Yosef. I've said it on other occasions. And they say as follows. The Isser of a woman who had been, let's say with a guy, no, the Isser of the Zona, because that's her status, is she's not, listen closely, she's not allowed to get married to the Kohen. Isha Zona B'chalol lo yikachu. They can't have a formal marriage. But it doesn't violate the Torah if they just live together and not as husband and wife. So ordinarily, we don't want people living without Chubba Kedusha. But in this case, suggests Rav Herzog, suggests Avad Yosef, in this case, because of emergency situation, basically, they said something like this. You're an Ashes Cohen, you were in Vienna, you were messed over and so forth, and now you escaped and you're coming back to your husband. Number one, get a get. And then, after the get, continue to live together as husband and wife. I mean, keep Taras Mishpacha, of course, and so forth. This is a husband and wife. I have Chubba Kedushin. We don't want to break up a family. You know what I'm saying? What happened was not your fault. And we're trying to satisfy the law. And if you have a din of bizona, you're not allowed to stay married to your husband. Stay with your husband anyway. And the whole world will understand it's a one-time special deal because of emergency situation, post-Holocaust. That is one way of getting around, circumventing the law. Okay, I get it. The other way, in my opinion, the straightforward way, resolves around the wording. He says, Shetiro lav medina al mikzoch tzarech shah. Okay? Kashalo yikalkalu. The Ramah says they just made a hara shah. What does that mean? Sounds like the Rashba. That is to say, on Tamei Anilach, even if you did something, we are invoking our supreme power as rabbis, and we're saying you can do it. It's a tzarech shah, and they have the right to be mater, mamash and ashes koin shenensa, labayla albi shebemis yishol din zona. Like in the Nidrim. Okay? And that was already in the 15th century when there was no Sanhedrin. So it's most unusual, but they did it. This is recorded. So Kal V'chomer, I think this would happen in the time of John Hyrcanus, in that terrible era when the regular halachic rules were stretched beyond their maximum limits as a result of the terrible gzeras of the Greeks. This is my reading of the Gemara in Kedushin. I was drawn to this interpretation of the sources, not simply because of my historicism, my historicist predilections. It's an appropriate reading for today, my father's yahrzeit. Because look, my father was a Kohen. He was born in 1900. He lived through a similar Shas Hazam B'Achema. He went through the Holocaust. And to be perfectly honest, I'm from a second marriage. So his wife and daughter from the first marriage would have been Shvuyas, right? They would have been subject to all these rules. Shvuyas was one of the big problems after 1945. If you know anything about the history of the post-Holocaust halacha. You know, I'm very serious. Here, Moshe Feinstein, I'm not kidding. Or of Henkin, New York, and these people are coming after the war, and miraculously, he survived, she survived, and he was over here and she was over there, and she was in Shvuya. How can they stay married? Are you telling me two people went through Hitler and all that Gehenna, and now that they, and Frum too, and now they come to New York to start life all over again, and they survived, and you tell them they can't stay married? Right? Well, that's a din.
So they had to wrestle with these issues big time, okay? As you can understand. The Holocaust, I'm talking about Aishas Cohen especially, and the Holocaust made Vienna look like a joke. I mean, in 1422. Now, tragically, in my case, my father's case, the whole Shalah never rose, because by the end of the war, his wife and daughter were dead. A few years ago, my sister in Eretz Yisrael was able to ascertain from official records that my father's first wife and daughter were murdered in December 1944, shortly before the war was over, in Stutthof concentration camp near Danzig. The Germans injected them, give them a shot of phenol, and that killed you right away. It's like a poison. That's who they were. And they put down the official cause of death as a heart attack. Had they survived, I guess these sugyas in the Nidrim and Yavamas and Kedushin and Ksubas would have been relevant, as they were to a generation of female Kohen wives of Holocaust survivors. But for what it's worth, the joint yahrzeit of the wife and daughter was not long ago, right after Hanukkah, 8 days in Ches Teves, 8 days in Teves. Since there's no one to commemorate them, they don't even have a grave. I will mention their names at my father's yahrzeit. His first wife was named Hodo Freda Bas Yankov Leib, and his daughter was Henny, or Henny Bas Yehuda Leib, that Cohen, the Shemi Kedama, or to be more exact, Henny Bas Leib Isaac, because my father changed his name. Some people did that after the Holocaust. Shina Shem Shina Mazel. So my father's Yehuda Leib, that's the name he picked for himself after the war. Okay? Because Leib Isaac didn't work out too well. Now, had they survived, I don't think I would be standing before you on this yahrzeit occasion. But that's above my grade. That's for Mekabalim and people more qualified to deal with metaphysical conundrums. I have some friends of mine who were at the Siyum today who are like that. Ordinarily not. Now I want to just share something at the end, because to give you a little bit of an idea of the world my father lived in, from the Hirschsprung book, the famous Gon Rav Hirschsprung from Montreal, and I mentioned this earlier this year in a podcast, last year, whatever. Yeah, here it is. Rav Hirschsprung wrote a Yiddish memoir. He escaped after going through Gehenna early, and I think by 41, he was already in Canada, I think. But he'd gone through terrible times with the Nazis and all this stuff. And he eventually made it to Vilna, which is part of Lithuania. And Lithuania, until June of 1940, was a safe place. People actually thought they'll ride out the storm and World War II won't hit them. Oh, were they mistaken, but that's what they thought. So people escaping, like Rav Hirschsprung, from Poland, whoever was able to cross the border in Lithuania. So the yeshivas in Poland were destroyed, and they went to Chaim Meiser in Lithuania, was still alive, in Vilna. And the plan was to restart the yeshivas up in different places in Lithuania. So, the Mir Yeshiva, which in Poland, will now be relocated to some town in Litauen. This yeshiva that had been in Poland will be in another town in Litauen. So one of the questions was Chachmi Lublin, which Lublin was taken over by the Germans, and it was terrible and killing and all this. Whoever survived, and he ran away to Lithuania, so maybe they can start up Chachmi Lublin in Litauen somewhere. And of course it is. Chaim Meiser tells of Hirschsprung, okay, he's a young man, go to Shabla. Shabla is the town where my father lived, the city where my father lived. That's what I'm telling this to you. And maybe create some money there and see how it works, So Rav Hirschsprung is a Galicianer Pilisha, and he's going to Lithuania where they've never even seen a Galicianer. I'm serious. And he describes wonderfully the world that's in which my father lived in. And he's saying over here, this is Rav. I'm reading from the memoirs of Hirschsprung, translated recently in English. He says, the journey to Shabla from Vilna caused me considerable anxiety. Until then, I never stepped out in public, and I feared my tattered appearance and my Galicianer accent would prevent my undertaking from being crowned with success. I also doubted whether Litvish Jews would respond with enthusiasm to an appeal for a Hasidic yeshiva. But I was wrong on all accounts. The Lithuanian Jews fulfilled the injunction of loving the stranger to a full extent. In Lithuania, every Jew lived and breathed the Torah. That's not exactly true, but there are plenty that did. Hence, it was not necessary to make the case for Talmud Torah. The love for Torah was natural in a feeling, and my success in Shavuot exceeded my expectations. As soon as I got off the train, and this is shortly before the Holocaust hit Lithuania. It's very tragic. As soon as I got off the train, I was lucky enough that a Jew came over to me and greeted me warmly. I asked the Jew, show me where the rabbi lived. He said, come with me, I'll take him myself. As we walked, he said, let me hold your satchel for you. I didn't want to do it, but the Jew, a very gracious and elegantly dressed man, became insistent that I do him a favor and let him be Meshamish Talmidei Chachamim. Right? He says, Hirschberg says, I said to the guy, how do you know I'm a Talmid Chacham? I can look at you, I can see. Hakar's Panim on, he said. I can't do it, said Hirschberg. I'm not comfortable with you being Meshamish me. Why? Hirschberg says, because I learned from Meir Shapir, my rabbi, I shouldn't do it. Why? The Litvak says, why? He says, my rabbi's listening on Lena said that he didn't want anybody Meshamish him. Either way, no Monashach. If I was not a Talmid Chacham really, then there'd be no one to serve. And since I'm a Talmid Chacham, I can serve myself. I'll be Mekandem to myself, Meshamish Talmid Chacham, if I carry my own bags. The Litvak looked at him and he said like this, your rabbi said that it's a joke and you're taking it seriously? If what he said was correct, the whole mitzvah of Meshamish Talmid Chacham wouldn't exist. Right? And therefore, what's your problem? Zen and if Zelo Chaser, get off my back. Let me carry your bag. So he let him do it. They came to the rabbi. This is a famous Reb Aryeh Bakst. Hashem Yikov Dama, who was killed by the Germans when they took over Shavuot later. The Rav welcomed me warmly. He's the one who was my father's Masada Kedusha the first time. The Rav welcomed me warmly with superabundant love. Had a conversation with the rabbi about the purpose of my visit, and the rabbi congratulated me with a Harvey Yashikoach and promised his assistance. I stayed at his house for lunch. The Jew who had been Meshamish me and accompanied me to the station, from the rabbi's house, handed me $100 bill. In Lithuania it was $100, which is a lot of money. And it was worth 20 American bucks in those days, when that was money. Okay? Now, in addition to that, this Yid ran all over Shavuot, announcing the purpose of my visit, with the result that Jews hurried from all directions to the rabbi's house to welcome me. Look at that. For the first time in my life, I had the opportunity to witness the tremendous devotion of the Lithuanian Jews to Talmud Torah. My eyes welled up with tears of joy, and it took all the strength I had not to cry. My work had been done for me. I didn't have to speak much or make any special appeal. After hearing a few words, they understood me at once. As it says, Dayal Hakim Baramiza, they immediately held a meeting at the house and formed a committee. They went all over town collecting money. Now, I'm sure if he called in all the well-to-do businessmen, my father was there at this meeting, because that's what he was. He was one of the rich guys in Shavuot at that time. That's why I find this story interesting. Within a few short hours, another committee which had been formed outside the house came with a request. And the request was, since in Vilna there are a lot of yeshivas, and in Shavuot there's not one yeshiva, as a matter of fairness, you should establish Chachmi Lubin Yeshiva here in Shavuot. I explained to them that Vilna had the Vada Yeshivas, the Chaim Meiser, and all the rest of it. They replied, we don't need any outside money. We have enough money in Shavuot. We can maintain the yeshiva. Okay? We're in position to maintain the yeshiva. So they're pressing him to say yes. I decided, Hirschberg says, to dampen the desire of the Jews for yeshiva in Shavuot, so I dropped a bombshell. I said, it's a Hasidic yeshiva. It's a Hasidic yeshiva. I was certain they would be disappointed, give me the money, and send me on my way. It turned out these Jews had not the slightest idea about Hasidus. They began bombarding me with questions. What is a Hasidic yeshiva all about? Before I could open my mouth, somebody in the group said, a Hasidic yeshiva means a yeshiva like the Ger Rebbe. Another one said, well, what's the yeshiva of the Ger Rebbe? You know, it's a yeshiva where they sing all day and dance and they make funny gestures and grimaces. That's what
And listen, wait, they didn't know what Chassidus was. You see for here, they didn't know. A third one says, how do you know that? I know because I heard the Mudjitzer Rebbe singing once, and he sang even better than the Ger Rebbe. What does it have to do with anything? And they all agreed unanimously to support a Hasidic yeshiva, and they all attacked me, each one pulling with me to eat by him. I can't eat it by everybody, so the rabbi said, whoever raises the most money, that'll eat by your house. Right? You'll eat by his house. The group dispersed, and only a Jew accompanied me from the station, remained behind. He said I should eat by him. And he said, when you start the yeshiva, I take on achrayus for 2 bacharim. Old school, They can eat and sleep by me. And, that night, I slept at the home of this Jew, and he claimed to me that he had met me, therefore he donated because he donated the first $100. The next day I went back to Vilna with money, clothing, a pair of shoes on my feet, because they saw I had bad shoes, and a deep respect and esteem for these Jews of Shabbat, who embodied all the good qualities of Hasidism without even knowing what Hasidus was. But he said he convinced them to just give the money and keep the yeshiva in Vilna, which they did. But a few months later, Stalin showed up, and then Hitler showed up, and all that fell apart. But I just wanted to share that with you because that's a glimpse into the world that my father grew up in before the war. So with that, I'll close it down, and I thank you. And Shem Shavali, as they say, actually the Litviks don't say that, but it's okay. It's no problem.